Be they levels, shrines, palaces, or temples, we know them collectively as dungeons, and they make up the real meat of progression through any Zelda game. While I usually tend to find the activities of the external world more interesting or memorable, there's no denying that the dungeons provide the direction and motivation to keep moving, and you can expect to spend at least half your playing time in these themed levels. It's only natural then that a ton of care goes into crafting these tests of ability to create a challenging, entertaining, and unique experience. While the improved graphics and the in-the-room camera angles of the 3D games lend themselves a greater awareness of the atmosphere of each dungeon, I think the 2D dungeons try to create just as much variety, but can be a little more easily overlooked. With that in mind, I want to take a closer look at the dungeons in one of my favorite games, The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. This is a magically fun and charming entry to the series, and while I think the heart of the game lies beyond the level design, I want to appreciate the designer's efforts here as well. So let's take a look. I'm the Blue Subrosian, and this is my survey of Koholint dungeons. The first dungeon on our list is one you won't even find in the original version of Link's Awakening. The Color Dungeon is a nice little optional addition in the DX version of the game. It's not all that big, but there are color-based puzzles, which obviously you won't be finding elsewhere in Link's Awakening, and a nice remix of the original dungeon theme from Legend of Zelda. It also has new enemies, including 2 mini-bosses and 1 boss. Overall, it's a pretty easy dungeon, and really only the Nightmare, who's apparently called Evil Orb, poses any challenge. He changes color from blue to red as he takes damage, and will quickly regenerate back up the scale, so you have to keep a constant assault in order to win. Upon doing so, you'll meet a fairy who will give you either a red or blue tunic, permanently increasing your attack or defense respectively. This is a nice feature as far as add-ons for a remake are concerned, but ultimately, I don't really like going there because I don't want permanent defense or attack upgrades for Link's Awakening. If you take the red tunic, then you essentially shortcut all combat down the line, which basically ruins the game in my opinion. Admittedly, Link's Awakening is pretty weak in the boss department already, so increasing your attack really makes the enemies laughable. Taking the blue tunic is a little better, because at least you can still experience the battle, but it's basically a game breaker nonetheless. This game is certainly not difficult enough to justify an upgrade like this, so I usually don't bother with this dungeon at all. The boss is a fun and pretty challenging fight, and for being added content, the Color Dungeon is pretty cool, but the overall tepid nature of this simple and easy dungeon makes it my least favorite in the game. I think I heard somewhere that the difficulty is scaled to the number of hearts you have when you enter. Well, I don't know about that, but if it's true, I would definitely recommend trying this one out after beating the game, as a sort of bonus challenge. Besides, that'll keep you from ruining the rest of the game with a gratuitous, overpowered upgrade. Usually with the first dungeon in a game, you can expect simplicity, and while Tail Cave is somewhat lacking in identity and is pretty straightforward, that doesn't make it unenjoyable to play. I think it serves its function as an introduction of sorts. See, these guys, for instance, can't be damaged with any items. You just have to knock them into the abyss, off the edge. No big deal, but at this point, it's the first time you've encountered something that won't take damage. I think the compass room is a particularly nice sort of welcome to the dungeon trap. When you first walk in, your focus is just on the treasure. But then when you approach the chest, carnage ensues as you're suddenly surrounded by 4 gels and the torches start shooting fireballs at you. Again, it's pretty easily handled, but if it's your first time and you had trouble knocking the beetles off the ledge, it could potentially do you in. The item is one of my favorite in the Game Boy games, the Rock's Feather, which gives you what none of the console games except Adventure of Link ever have, the ability to jump at will. I think jumping over pits and enemies and having to reach higher to attack are nice gameplay features, and the Rock's Feather is what makes it possible. But I don't think it's used very well in the Tail Cave, especially when you compare to what the Wing Dungeon of Oracle of Ages and the Moth's Lair of Oracle of Seasons did with the concept. I guess those benefit from being the second and third dungeons in their games, respectively, and not to mention being developed years after Link's Awakening. Anyway, the mini-boss is funny looking and would be decent enough if they limited the amount of times you can hit him before he hops back to his roller. The Nightmare, however, is really weak, taking a measly 4 hits to... Whoa, that's dismal. Given its quite cool location, Bottle Grotto comes up a little short in terms of atmosphere. Bottles are the theme here, with bottle in the name, filling many of the rooms, the shape of the dungeon itself, and even the boss is a freaking bottle in this place. Not to mention that the dungeon item is the power bracelet, made for lifting bottles, of course! And also rocks and bushes and skulls and disguises off of some enemies, which usually involves taking damage. Bottles, bottles, bottles! Overall, this dungeon is not super memorable for me, but I do like a couple of things. First, as strange as it may be, I appreciate the fact that they made a dungeon with a non-conventional theme. You'll find elemental themes in almost every game involving dungeons ever, but where else would you find a tableware-themed dungeon? Yeah, it may have fallen a little flat, but I appreciate the original attempt nonetheless. Also, this dungeon gets points for its non-linearity. It'll make you backtrack a little bit, which I prefer. I also like how much it makes you use the magic powder. You see, magic powder was necessary for getting the tail key, but there's nowhere to use it in the tail cave. But then you make it to Bottle Grotto and there are torches needing to be lit everywhere. I just kinda see it as a sign that no item in Link's Awakening will be useless after its initial use. At least not for a while. The most memorable part of this dungeon for me is the puzzle in this room. I was stuck here for so long. A lot of times dungeon rooms require you to wipe out all the enemies in order to make a door open or a chest appear, a key to drop, or just otherwise proceed, but it's not quite that simple in this room. There is a stone slate or an owl statue that gives pretty clear instructions on how to get the Nightmare's key from this room, but since it isn't in the same room, and when I first played this, I hadn't the foggiest idea what a Pole's voice was, it didn't really help me much. But that's okay, it just made it all the more rewarding to finally solve it on my own. Of all the dungeons in Link's Awakening, the third is definitely the one for which I have the most nostalgia. Fortunately, that's not all this dungeon has going for me, as I think Key Cavern is well designed in its own right. The third level of the game turns up the complexity several notches from the previous two. This dungeon has two simple themes, which I think it uses pretty well. The first would be keys, as can be assumed from the name of the level. Continuing the map shape trend from the previous dungeon, it's shaped like two keys, and not to disappoint, there are a lot of keys in this dungeon. One thing I like about this is there are two separate times where you're faced with 4 different locks at once. Not only does this give a sense of depth to an actually mediocre-sized dungeon, since you know you have to be earning multiple keys to progress, but in some cases, like this one for example, it really helps give a feel of non-linearity. This dungeon also requires you to bomb inconspicuous-looking walls and combine 2 separate items, Pegasus Boots and the Rock's Feather, in order to jump farther to proceed. It also introduces these cool warping penguin guys who fire shuriken at you that are pretty fun to fight. I like the mini-boss here, 2 hungry giant ants who can only be damaged by eating bombs. These guys can actually be more of a threat than some of the bosses in this game, and unlike any Zelda games released since, there are no bombs provided in the room itself, so you have to watch your supply, or else you'll have to leave, stock up, and start the fight all over again. It helps that you can throw bombs and even pick them up again to keep them from exploding, but most of the Let's Players I've seen are apparently not aware of that, and we're just trying to set them on the floor in an unpredictable path of the ants, NES style. That makes it a lot harder. At least the room provides an exit in case you run out of bombs, instead of just making you kill yourself like Adventure of Link would. But anyway, the second theme is slimes. Besides using the slime key to unlock the door behind the slime-topped fence, the entire dungeon is filled with these little gels, or zoles apparently. Waiting in rooms, hiding in floors, even in treasure chests, these amorphous little guys are infectious. On top of that, the Nightmare himself is basically a giant version of the same enemy, called Slime Eye, and even when you get to his room, he stays in hiding, choosing instead to endlessly stick zoles on you until you die or draw him out. The negative thing about this dungeon for me is that you don't actually need to get several of the keys if you know which rooms not to bother with, and there's even an extra key that can't be used anywhere at all if you collected all the others. I assume that this was to counteract a potentially game-breaking mistake of using keys in the wrong place at some point, but I'm not sure where, and it seems like there could have been a better solution. All in all, I think this dungeon presents a significant step up in quality from the previous two, and is fairly unique with all the locks everywhere. It does well at not recycling puzzles in different rooms, too. From jumping, to bombing, to seeking out slimes, to charging through rocks or repelling force, right up to confronting the final nightmare, the Key Cavern has some tricks up its sleeve. And these guys. Ugh! For me, the most memorable part of the 4th dungeon, Angler's Tunnel, is the process of getting into it. While I think that speaks volumes for the quality of the enchanting world of Koholint and the pacing of Link's Awakening, it doesn't say much for the quality of the dungeon itself. The first time I played it, someone told me it's possible to use your keys wrong and make this dungeon unbeatable, but I've never been able to make that happen. In fact, you actually wind up with extra keys left over if you use the Pegasus Boots to long jump around the corner like this, which I can rarely resist doing, even though I know that's not really what you're supposed to do. Anyway, this dungeon is just all wet and watery, presenting a hazardous terrain until you get the flippers. I think it's more about navigation and item switching than combat or puzzles, involving jumping, blocking, swimming, bombing, long jumping, and so forth. There are several times in Angler's Tunnel where you're shown an unreachable destination, which you have to maneuver back to later on. I like that in principle, and it kind of makes the dungeon feel a little bigger and more connected. All in all, Angler's Tunnel is fine, but nothing special for me. Although I do kind of like trying not to fall in the water for some reason. And while the Nightmare bosses aren't really the focus of this list, the Anglerfish deserves a special mention for being in contention for the worst dungeon boss in Zelda history. He's so easy, and even when I intentionally lolled around to give him time to attack me... Ugh.